The air on the construction site hummed with a different energy. Not the steady rhythm of skilled labor, but the frantic, impatient buzz of a deadline. The smell of fresh-cut lumber was overpowered by the acrid scent of diesel from idling machinery and the chemical tang of fast-drying adhesives. In the center of this organized chaos stood Brendan Shaw, a man in his early 30s who wore a designer hard hat like a crown. His vest was spotless, his boots unscuffed. He was pointing at a tablet screen, barking orders to a group of younger engineers who nodded with frantic agreement. And then there was Walter. He moved through the site with a different gravity entirely. His boots were worn leather, scarred by decades of sawdust and weather. His hands, rough and mapped with veins that stood out like old roots, carried a wooden toolbox that had seen more seasons than Brendan's entire crew combined. His most prominent tool was a simple, beautifully maintained brass level, its glass vials catching the morning light. He wasn't looking at tablets or blueprints. His eyes were on the joints, the seams, the way the foundation met the freshly poured slab. He found a quiet spot near the main support beam of the newest model home and set his toolbox down with a soft, definitive thud. That's when Brendan noticed him. The developer's face twisted from focused intensity to bewildered contempt. He strode over, his entourage following like a wake. "Can I help you?" Brendan's voice was sharp, a blade meant to cut through nonsense. He looked Walter up and down, his gaze lingering on the wooden toolbox, the simple level. "The Historical Society tour was last week. You lost?" Walter didn't look at him immediately. He finished running a thumb along a seam in the framing, feeling for a truth no laser level could show. He finally turned, his eyes a pale, calm blue in a face etched by sun and time. "Just having a look," he said, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting deep underground. Brendan let out a short, humorless laugh. "A look? At what? The museum missing an exhibit?" He gestured broadly at the high-tech site. "We're building the future here. Prefab panels, CAD-designed load balances, polymer-sealed foundations. That," he pointed a dismissive finger at Walter's level, "that is a paperweight, a souvenir." One of the junior engineers snickered, quickly covering it with a cough. Walter's expression didn't change. He held up the level, placing it gently on a newly installed windowsill. The bubble drifted slightly, then settled dead center. "It tells the truth," Walter said simply. "Doesn't need a battery, doesn't need an update." "The truth?" Brendan shot back, his patience evaporating. "The truth is we're 20% ahead of schedule because we don't rely on antiques. The truth is efficiency, profitability. That little toy can't calculate structural stress or thermal expansion. My software models the wind shear on this entire development. What's your piece of wood do?" "Your computer says the house is level," Walter replied, his quiet tone making Brendan's outburst seem childish. "My level shows when the ground beneath it is lying." The challenge hung in the humid air. The conflict was no longer subtext. It was the only thing in the space between them, the arrogance of speed against the quiet certainty of integrity, the glow of a screen against the polished brass of a tool that had never lied. Walter ignored the tension, turning his attention from the window frame back to the ground. He knelt slowly, the joints in his knees protesting softly. He scooped up a handful of the dark, damp earth from the edge of the foundation excavation. He let it sift through his fingers, his head tilted, listening to a story the soil was telling him. Brendan watched, arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. "You planning on planting a garden? The landscaping crew comes next week." Walter closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the grit, the moisture content. He looked up at the sleek angular lines of the nearly finished house, then down at the earth it was built upon. "The water table," he said, his voice low enough that Brendan had to lean in slightly to hear. "It's higher than your plans account for. This soil, it's holding water like a sponge. You've poured your slab, but the ground beneath it is whispering. It's not stable. Not for this." Brendan's smirk vanished, replaced by impatience. He held up his tablet, tapping the screen aggressively. This soil has been core sampled, analyzed, and digitally modeled by the best geological software money can buy. The compaction ratios are perfect. The drainage calculations are optimal. The computer says it's fine." He said the last word like a verdict, a final judgment from a higher power. This time, the laughter from his team wasn't hidden. It was a release of nervous energy, a communal dismissal of the old man's superstition. One of them, emboldened, chimed in. "Yeah, old-timer. The computer modeled the rain for the next 50 years. We're good." Walter looked at the laughing men, and for the first time, a profound, weary sadness showed in his eyes. It wasn't anger at the mockery. It was the deep sorrow of a man who sees a disaster coming and is powerless to stop it, because nobody will listen. He saw not just a foundation, but the families that would live there, the lives that would be built within those walls. He saw the subtle sinking, the cracks spiderwebbing through drywall, the doors that would no longer close. He slowly got to his feet, brushing the dirt from his hands. He looked at Brendan, not with defiance, but with a final, solemn certainty. "The computer only knows the dirt you told it to know," he said. "It doesn't know the history of this land. It doesn't remember the spring that used to run right where we're standing." He picked up his toolbox and his level. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his broad, stooped shoulders moving through the chaotic energy of the site. He was an island of silence, retreating from a sea of noise. The crew's laughter slowly died down, the echo of it feeling hollow and foolish in the wake of his quiet exit. The tension of experience being ridiculed lingered, a bad taste the arrogance couldn't quite wash away. Brendan shook his head, dismissing the strange interruption, and turned back to his screen, to the clean, certain world of data where nothing ever whispered. The storm didn't arrive with a gentle warning. It came as a declaration of war. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind began to howl, a sound utterly foreign to this landscape of pristine new construction. Then the rain came, not in drops but in solid sheets of water that turned the manicured lots into quagmires and hammered against the vinyl siding with the force of 1,000 drummers. It was a test the computers had predicted, but nature, it seemed, hadn't read their reports. Inside the homes, the new sounds began. Not the comforting patter of rain on a sturdy roof, but a symphony of distress, a low, groaning creak from within the walls, a sound of pressure and protest. Then, the sharper, more alarming cracks. Hairline fractures, thin as spider silk, appeared in the corners of ceilings, tracing delicate, terrifying paths through the fresh paint. Doors that had swung freely just that morning began to stick, their perfect alignment warping as the structures they were set into subtly shifted. It was a slow, almost imperceptible sinking, a sigh of resignation from foundations that were never meant to bear this weight on this ground. The first call came from an elderly woman in Unit 12. Her voice was thin with panic on Brendan's phone. "My kitchen floor. It doesn't feel right. It's sloping." Then another call, and another. Panic, raw and contagious, began to spread through the new community. These weren't just properties. They were life savings, fresh starts, dreams made manifest in drywall and hardwood. For the elderly residents, the fear was profound. This wasn't just an investment crumbling, but the terrifying prospect of instability in the one place that was supposed to be safe. Brendan and his team arrived in a convoy of shiny trucks, their arrogance replaced by a frantic, buzzing energy. They looked like they had arrived to solve a problem, armed with their technology. They unloaded tripod-mounted laser scanners that painted the interior walls with grids of light, mapping every micron of deviation. They pushed sophisticated moisture meters against baseboards, their screens flashing with alarming red readings. They connected tablets to wireless sensors buried in the foundations, downloading torrents of data. The computers churned, processors whirring, comparing the real-time chaos to their pristine digital models. But the answers they provided weren't solutions, they were contradictions. The stress analysis software conflicted with the hydrostatic readings. The thermal imaging showed cold spots that defied the architectural schematics. The technology, in the face of a real complex crisis, didn't provide answers. It provided noise, a chorus of conflicting data that told them everything was wrong, but gave them no clue how to make it right. The storm outside was beginning to subside, but the storm of their failure was just beginning. The desperation was a physical presence in the model home Brendan was using as a command post. The air was thick with it, mingling with the smell of wet concrete and fear. His young engineers sat slumped over their devices, the glow of their screens illuminating faces etched with confusion and exhaustion. Their certitude had evaporated, leaving behind the cold dread of catastrophic failure. The phones wouldn't stop ringing. Each one was another homeowner, another complaint, another nail in the coffin of his reputation. Brendan stared out the warped window frame, watching the water drip from the gutters. His mind raced through a list of consultants, engineers, experts, all of them distant, all of them expensive, all of them likely to demand the same mountain of data that had already proven useless. And then his gaze fell on a single muddy footprint near the doorway, left hours earlier by a man in worn leather boots. Walter. The memory of the old man's warning echoed in his head, not as a mockery now, but as a prophecy. The ground beneath it is whispering. The decision tasted like ash. It was an admission of failure so complete it was almost physical. He turned to his lead engineer, whose earlier smugness had been replaced by a pale anxiety. "Get me the number for Walter," Brendan said, the words dragged out of him. "The carpenter." The engineer looked at him, bewildered. "Walter, with the wood level? What can he do?" "Just get the number," Brendan snapped, the last vestige of his authority cracking. The call was made, the conversation short and humiliatingly polite. There were no "I told you so's," just a quiet, "I'll be there." When Walter's old pickup truck rumbled onto the sodden site an hour later, the contrast was starker than ever. The frantic high-tech chaos of the recovery effort framed the slow, deliberate arrival of this man from another time. He stepped out, dressed exactly as before, and retrieved the same worn wooden toolbox and that simple gleaming brass level from his passenger seat. He looked around, taking in the scanners, the wires, the faces of the defeated crew, his expression unreadable. The mockery this time was different. It wasn't the loud, confident jeering of before. It was quieter, born of nervous insecurity. A few of the younger engineers exchanged skeptical glances, whispering behind their hands. Their entire world of data had failed them, and the solution had arrived in the form of a man with a hand tool. It made no sense to them. Brendan walked over, his earlier bravado gone, replaced by a strained, desperate formality. "Walter, thank you for coming. We have a situation." He gestured weakly at the failing structure. Then the challenge came, not as a taunt, but as a plea from a man who had run out of options. Can you show us what your little level can do?" Walter gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't look at the tablets displaying chaotic sensor data or the laser grids mapping the warped walls. His attention was already elsewhere, his pale blue eyes scanning the room not as a collection of problems, but as a single, breathing entity in distress. He set his wooden toolbox on the damp floor with a quiet finality that silenced the last of the nervous whispers. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he walked to the wall where the largest crack snaked toward the ceiling. He placed his palm flat against the drywall, then his ear, closing his eyes. The engineers watched, baffled, as he stood there for a full minute, listening to the house sigh and settle. He finally moved to the toolbox, unlatched it, and took out two tools, his brass level and a simple, well-worn plumb bob. He ignored the digital screens showing conflicting readouts for millimeters of shift. He held the level against the main support beam. The bubble drifted, hesitated, and settled slightly off-center, a discrepancy no digital eye would have even registered. He made a soft, thoughtful sound in his throat. He then pinned the string of the plumb bob to the top of the same beam and let the weight drop. It should have hung straight down a chalk line snapped days earlier. It didn't. It swung in a tiny, almost lazy circle, describing a minute orbit around the true vertical. The beam wasn't just off-level, its entire relationship to the earth below had changed. The stark contrast was breathtaking. The young men with their frantic technology were trying to diagnose a patient by reading 1,000 conflicting vital signs simultaneously. Walter was listening to the patient's heartbeat with a wooden stethoscope. He moved through the house with a methodical, silent rhythm, a dance of deep intuition. He'd run his fingers along a seam where the floor met the wall, feeling for a draft of cold, damp air no thermal camera had detected. He'd tap a section of concrete foundation with the handle of his screwdriver, listening to the echo. A solid thunk here, a hollow, worrying resonance there. He was reading the language of the building, a syntax of stress and strain written in creaks and cracks and subtle shifts, a language the computers were utterly deaf to. The moment of discovery didn't come with a blaring alarm or a flashing red light on a screen. It came in the far corner of the basement, a space crowded with modern HVAC equipment and conduit. Walter knelt, brushing away a pile of spilled insulation with his hand. He placed his level on the concrete floor. The bubble was wildly off. He cleared more debris, revealing the junction where the foundation wall met the poured slab. And there it was, a hairline crack, so fine it was nearly invisible, weeping a dark, steady trickle of water. But it wasn't the crack itself that was critical. It was its location. It ran directly beneath the main load-bearing point for the entire side of the house. The computers had mapped thousands of data points but had missed the single, critical flaw. The foundation hadn't failed uniformly. It had pivoted on this one unseen weakness, a tiny fracture acting as a fulcrum, levering the entire structure into a slow, catastrophic tilt. Walter looked up from the flaw, his eyes meeting Brendan's. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The truth was there, in the damp concrete and the silent, unwavering brass of his level. The low hum of an approaching vehicle broke the tense silence. A town car, sleek and black, pulled up through the mud, its official plate stark against the grime. The door opened, and out stepped Mayor Evans, a woman in her 60s with a steely gaze and a reputation for no-nonsense authority. She took in the scene with a single sweeping look, the demoralized engineers, their expensive gear now seeming like toys, the anxious homeowners huddled under a canopy, Brendan Shaw, his confidence visibly shattered, and the old carpenter kneeling by a crack in the foundation. Her expression hardened. She walked directly to Walter, her polished shoes ignoring the puddles. "Walter," she said, her voice carrying easily across the hushed site, "I had a feeling I'd find you here when I heard the calls coming in." She then turned to face Brendan and his team, her presence immediately becoming the center of gravity in the chaos. "Do you have any idea who you've had the audacity to mock?" she asked, her voice low but cutting through the air like a blade. Brendan could only stare, his mouth slightly agape. The mayor didn't wait for an answer. "This is Walter Vale. His name might not mean anything to you and your software, but his work is the bedrock of this town, literally." She gestured out beyond the failing development. "He built the community center that weathered the hurricane of '98. He framed the library addition that never settled an inch. The cross-bracing in the old church steeple, his design, his hands. He knows this land because he's been listening to it for 50 years. He knows where the old streams run buried. He knows which clay pockets hold water and which bedrock shelves are true. Your computer model's a fantasy. He remembers the truth. The humiliation was total and absolute. It wasn't just about being wrong. It was about the profound, gut-wrenching scale of their error." Brendan's face flushed a deep, mortified red. The weight of his arrogance, his dismissal, his cheap jokes about museums. It all crashed down on him with the physical force of a collapsing beam. He had not only insulted a man, he had insulted the living history of the place he was trying to exploit. He looked at Walter's worn hands, those hands that had built the enduring heart of the community, and then at his own soft, clean ones, and the shame was a physical sickness. The members of his team looked at the ground, their faces burning, finally seeing the master they had dismissed as a relic. The quiet dignity of the man they'd laughed at now loomed over them, immense and unassailable. Walter watched the wave of shame crash over the young developer and his team. He saw Brendan's deflation, the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of the mayor's words. But Walter's face showed no victory, no gloating satisfaction. The profound sadness that had been in his eyes during the first confrontation was still there, but now it was tempered with a flicker of something else, not pity, but a weary sense of obligation. The problem wasn't solved. The houses were still sinking. His focus wasn't on their humiliation, but on the fracture in the concrete, on the families waiting in fear. He turned away from the spectacle of their downfall and knelt again by the foundational flaw. He opened his toolbox, the well-oiled hinges silent. He didn't pull out a power tool or a high-tech resin injector. He selected a few simple items: a heavy-duty metal brace, a bag of a special fast-setting hydraulic cement he mixed himself in a small bucket, and a trowel worn thin from decades of use. The lesson wasn't going to be spoken in a triumphant speech. It was going to be spoken in action, in the deliberate, careful application of a solution that was as simple and robust as the problem was complex. The crew, chastened and silent, gathered around at a respectful distance, their earlier arrogance replaced by a desperate, hungry curiosity. They watched his hands, those old, scarred, knowledgeable hands, work with an economy of motion they'd never seen on any YouTube tutorial. He wasn't fighting the house, he was working with it, understanding its new, stressed geometry and coaxing it back toward true. The real cost of their cheap, fast construction was measured in the fear of the elderly residents and the cracks in the walls. The value of his true craft was measured in the quiet certainty of each movement, in the absolute integrity of a repair that wouldn't just hold, but would last. A shift was occurring in the crew's perspective. They were beginning to see the structure not as a collection of assembled parts, but as a whole, living thing. They were beginning to understand that the most important foundation being laid right now wasn't made of concrete and steel, but of patience, respect, and a humility that had been desperately missing. Under Walter's quiet direction, the repair was executed not with frantic energy, but with a steady, purposeful rhythm. The crew, now his students, followed his instructions with a focus they'd never given their computer models. The hydraulic cement was packed deep into the fissure, the custom-fabricated brace bolted into place with a satisfying finality that echoed through the basement. Almost immediately, the terrible, groaning complaints from the house above began to quiet. The slow, sinister sinking stopped. The development, so perilously close to total failure, was pulled back from the brink and made secure not by gigabytes of data, but by the old-school mastery of one man who knew how to listen. When the work was done, Walter packed his tools with the same deliberate care he'd used to unpack them. He wiped his trowel clean, closed the lid of his wooden box, and latched it shut. The final, quiet image was of him walking back to his truck, the same stooped figure who had been mocked hours before. But the space around him was utterly transformed. The air, once thick with arrogant noise, now hummed with a silent, profound respect. The mockery was gone, replaced by the enduring understanding that true power isn't found in the newest technology or the fastest schedule. It is found in the patience to do a thing right, in the skill earned through decades of practice, and in the quiet integrity that builds things to last. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. His legacy was secured in the solid ground beneath their feet, and the lesson etched into their minds.